Can't decide and torn between a romantic, comedy, action, or an indie film to watch for the weekend? Well. Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast is your ultimate guide to the latest movies. Join us as we dissect the latest on the blockbusters. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast.
Thank you for tuning in to the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Elizabeth Aaron. Happy Halloween, everyone. I know there are some people who just love Halloween. They love getting dressed up. They love going trick-or-treating. And this year, it's probably going to be a pretty different Halloween, considering we're all still sheltering in place. And in a way, that speaks to the theme of the movies that I'm going to be talking about today. Sometimes things just don't quite turn out the way you think they're going to. In terms of movies, while I never really know what the end is going to be, I do feel like things are going to wrap up pretty nicely and neatly. Well, in today's movies, that's actually not completely the case. Now, I'm in kind of a bind because I don't want to tell you what's going to happen at the end of these movies, but I will say that the ends are not exactly what I thought they would be. I'm still not exactly sure what to make of that. On one hand, I appreciate that it shows how life can be messy, and on the other hand, things are so messy in the world today that I kind of found these endings to be a bit debatable. And that was actually kind of fun in a way, to think, well, how could this have ended, and should it have ended differently? So I guess what it comes down to is all of the movies that I watched for today are thought-provoking. I watched 4 movies, all of them were on Amazon Prime, and they came free with my Amazon Prime membership. So I will be reviewing today The Goldfinch with Nicole Kidman in the first segment of the show. In the second segment of the show, I'll be giving my thoughts on the Brazilian movie Invisible Life. In the third segment of the show, I'll be sharing my thoughts on the movie Trial by Fire with Laura Dern. And in the final segment of the show, I hope you'll stick around because I'll be talking about the movie Little Pink House with Catherine Keener. So let's dive on in. As I mentioned, the first movie I'm going to talk about is called The Goldfinch. This is a movie that was produced by Amazon. It came out in September of 2019. It's a drama, and it's 2 hours and 29 minutes long, and it's rated R. The director of this movie is John Crowley, and he has won a good number of awards for 3 of his films. Brooklyn was a BAFTA award winner for Best British Film. He also won Best Director for Fiction Entertainment at the BAFTA Awards for Boy A. And both of these movies have also won additional awards at film festivals. And then there's his movie Intermission, which has won an award at the British Independent Film Awards, the Galway Film Flead, the Golden Rooster Awards, and the Irish Film and Television Awards. He has a total of 9 director credits, and some of the other feature films that he's directed include Is Anybody There? And Closed Circuit. The main character in this movie is Theo Decker, and we see Theo as a young teen as well as an adult. As a young teen, he's played by Oakes Fegley. He's been in such movies as Pete's Dragon, Wonderstruck, and The Truth About Lies. The adult Theo Decker is played by Ansel Elgort, and he was nominated for Best Performance by an Actor in a Motion Picture, Musical, or Comedy for Baby Driver at the Golden Globes. He has also won the Male Star of Tomorrow Award at Cinecon USA. He also won Best New Lead Film Actor for The Fault in Our Stars at the New Now Next Awards, and among other awards at the Teen Choice Awards, he did win Choice Movie Actor Drama for also The Fault in Our Stars. Other movies he's been in include Carrie, Divergent, Men, Women, and Children, and Billionaire Boys Club. And this movie stars Nicole Kidman, who has won Best Actress in a Leading Role for The Hours at the Academy Awards. She's also a Golden Globe winner, having won Best Performance by an Actress in a Limited Series or a Motion Picture Made for Television for Big Little Lies. And she also won Golden Globes for The Hours as well as To Die For. She also won a Primetime Emmy Award for Big Little Lies, and she won a BAFTA Award for The Hours. Other movies she's been in that have won a variety of awards include Boy Erased, Lion, The Others, Railway Man, and Moulin Rouge. Her other movies include Billy Bathgate, Batman Forever, Practical Magic, The Human Stain, Rabbit Hole, Grace of Monaco, and The Beguiled. Other actors with more supporting roles that you might recognize in this movie include Jeffrey Wright, Luke Wilson, Sarah Paulson, and Finn Wolfhard. This movie is based on the novel of the same name, The Goldfinch, by Donna Tartt. It came out in 2013. It centers around the impact of a trauma that happened to our main character, Theo Decker, when he was a preteen. He and his mom were at the Metropolitan Museum of Art when a bomb exploded. His mom died, and at the museum he had noted a young woman that he was kind of interested in, and an older gentleman that she was with. And after the bomb exploded, he ran into the older man who gave him a ring and asked him to deliver it to the place that was mentioned inside the ring. And the older man suggested that Theo take a painting, the painting of the Goldfinch, which was a famous painting, and he said Theo should take it to protect it. All of this threw Theo's life into chaos. And yet, through the chaos, there were some gifts. So the first and obvious part of the chaos was that suddenly Theo was essentially an orphan. His dad, not too long before this incident, had left he and his mom, and Theo had no idea where he was. So essentially, he was an orphan. He wasn't aware of any other family he had who could take him in. So he gave the name of a family that he knew through his school. He went to a private school and was kind of friends with this kid, Andy, who I think was about his age, but seemed a little bit younger, was definitely smaller. The family agreed to take him in. They already had 4 or 5 children, and what was one more mouth to feed? They were a very wealthy family, so they took him in because they knew he didn't have any other place to go. And in this family, the mother was Samantha, and she is played by Nicole Kidman. And she seemed to be the one who was mostly in charge of taking care of Theo. She called the shots, and her husband, who was a real character, he was kind of entertaining, but he wasn't very fatherly to Theo. There seemed to be a lot of awkwardness at first, both because Theo was trying to figure out what his life was going to be like without his mother, but also going from an only child to a family with a bunch of kids was challenging for him. And he needed to figure out how this family operated, so he knew where he stood. He never quite felt like a part of the family, at least until he was invited to go with them to their summer camp up in Maine. This seemed to really perk up his feelings because it was a sign that they wanted him around. They were willing to help him feel like part of the family and to participate with them. So he was feeling more solid and a little bit more at ease. But during the time that was especially more tumultuous when he was trying to get settled, he felt this obligation to deliver the ring that the older man in the museum had given to him. It led him to an antique shop and to a man named Hobie who had been the older man's business partner, and Hobie was an expert at refinishing antiques. Hobie was also taking care of the young girl that Theo had seen in the museum. Her name is Pippa, and she had actually been injured in the blast. And the fact that he and Pippa had survived the blast, it gave them something in common. It gave them a bond, and this was something that was very reassuring to Theo. For him, it was more of a love bond, and as he got older, he really felt that connection with Pippa more and more. So this antique shop became a place of escape and of acceptance. He had much freedom here. Hobie really encouraged him and also taught him more about the antique business and about how to refinish furniture. If there had been a way for Theo to move in and live with Hobie, I think he would have. It just wasn't really in the cards. Meanwhile, another important aspect to Theo's survival after the bombing was this painting, The Goldfinch. It seemed to eventually symbolize his mother, and it's because it's the last piece of work that they had shared together, seen together. It was the last moment they had had together, seeing this painting. In the news, it talked about how this painting had probably been destroyed in the blast, but Theo knew that he still had it, and there were moments where he would just hug it tight. He just missed his mother so much, and it was a kind of poor replacement of her, but it was the closest thing he had to remembering her. So back to the story, Theo never quite got to Maine because his father showed up. He moved with his father to Nevada, and his life there was very different. From here on out, I'm not going to be too specific. I don't want to give away what really happens. But in Nevada, he learned more about how his father lived, which was not to his own liking. And he befriended another boy who was also very isolated. And together they experimented with drugs and went on adventures, but then something happens and Theo runs back to New York. And back in New York, life is not what he expected. He reconnects with the family that he had lived with, and there's an entanglement that happens there. And then there's a whole mystery that unfolds with regard to the painting of the goldfinch. And all of the drama he had had as a child starts unfolding in another way. There's this attempt, it seems, the universe has to help him resolve it. And we get to watch whether or not that's truly going to happen. As I mentioned earlier in the show about the theme of today's show, things do happen and there is some level of resolution, yet it is not in the way that you might think it would happen, or that, well, I know at least for myself that I wanted it to happen. And that way the movie keeps you guessing, and that's a really positive thing. In another way, it was really thought-provoking for me, just wanting to understand how things turned out the way that they did. I felt at the beginning of the movie, probably the first half anyway, things moved pretty slowly. I have a feeling that was intentional. After a trauma, things probably slow down a lot. You're probably more vigilant. You need to pay attention to what happens moment to moment. So I could see the reason for that, but as the viewer, I found my mind wandering from time to time. Overall, the acting was good. The characters were well crafted, but I didn't find many of the characters very likable. Nicole Kidman's character as the mom who took Theo in, I have to say she was just downright spooky. She seemed cold and disconnected, and maybe that's how the character was supposed to be. I found it pretty confusing. And again, maybe that was on point. Maybe Theo was supposed to feel confused with his mom not being there and then being under the care of a woman who was so different from her. I would say this was not one of my favorite roles for Nicole Kidman. Also, something I've noticed about Nicole Kidman when she's playing an American actor is she gets a very breathy voice. It's like she doesn't have confidence that she'll overcome her Australian accent, and as a result her voice comes from her throat and not from her belly. And the result for me is I feel like she doesn't completely embody the character. So that was a little bit of a disappointment for me. Now Luke Wilson plays Larry, who is Theo's dad. And while we only see glimpses of Theo's mom in flashbacks, well, you can see why he wouldn't have lasted with her. She seems like a wholesome, grounded person. He's kind of sporadic and all over the place, but at the same time, I couldn't even picture them together. I felt he was a poor choice in casting. I didn't really believe that he was the type of character that he was supposed to play. I think he struggled pulling it off. I would say again, just like with Nicole Kidman, this wasn't one of Luke Wilson's better roles. In terms of the actors who played the young and old Theo, and also there was a younger and older version of the friend that Theo made in Nevada, I felt those were cast pretty well. The actors looked similar, and I felt they had similar temperaments. I didn't completely buy the older and younger Pippa, and I think it's hard to find a child actor who has the acting chops as well as the same essence as the adult character. I love when it does really match up. I think they did a pretty good job of this movie, but it wasn't perfect. Overall, the story flowed well, and I think that is due to the acting ability of the characters. They were connected. They did do a pretty good job of keeping the story going and showing the emotional range. I do feel, though, that there were just some odd choices. There are also some things that happened to a bunch of the characters, and I don't want to give away what that was, but I just felt that there was so much tragedy in this movie, and I didn't find it believable. I also didn't find it believable that Theo would go to live with a family from his school when this tragedy happened to him. Very temporarily, yes, but there didn't seem to be any reason that this family would take him in other than they felt bad for him, but they also seemed like a dysfunctional family and pretty cold. And I just would have thought Child Protective Services would have stepped in, or Theo would have known that the authorities were going to look for his father. Some of these things just didn't add up. Now, I would say that there are some good twists and turns in this movie, some things that I didn't see coming, and that really helped keep the story flowing. But this movie covers quite a span of time, and we see the same characters, some as children, some as adults, but the movie focuses only on these characters that we see in their different parts of life. And as a result, it seemed like Theo himself had a very limited life with just a limited cast of characters. Other than when he was a child walking in the hallway at school, we didn't see that there were a lot of other people in his life. In that way, this movie didn't seem super believable to me. Much of the story felt contrived and not naturally unfolding. I will say that it was a beautiful movie to watch. It was really well filmed. It definitely has something to offer, but in the grand scheme of things, I can't say that I walked away feeling like that was a great movie or that I really liked it. Also, it's a long movie. I didn't feel it needed to be 2.5 hours long. I've seen movies that were an hour and a half or 2 hours that made me feel like a lot had happened, and I was much more satisfied at the end. I felt like the story really completed well. I would not say that was really the case with this movie, and I don't feel like I had a strong emotional reaction to what had happened. So on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being most excellent movie, I would give this movie a 6. I'm not saying it's not worth the watch. I think there are elements that are intriguing and it will keep you going, but at the same time, I've just seen other movies that really knocked it out of the park for me, and this was not one of them. Now stay tuned for the next segment of the show when I'll be talking about the Brazilian movie Invisible Life after the break.
Want to know the latest and hottest music hitting the airwaves? Don't be left out. Listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Music Podcast. It keeps you on the loop with everything you need to know from pop, rock, hip-hop, and the top 40. And we'll throw in news of your favorite artists, concert and tour dates, and so much more. Listen no further, because this is the gold standard in music podcast.
Thanks for joining the second segment of the show. I'm your host, Elizabeth Aaron. In the last segment, I talked about the movie The Goldfinch. I'm now going to discuss the movie Invisible Life, which is a Brazilian movie. Now, this is also an Amazon original movie. It came out in 2019. It's 2 hours and 19 minutes long. It's a drama and it's rated R. This movie has won a number of awards. The director, Karim Anouz, has won the Un Certain Regard Award at the Cannes Film Festival. This movie won a number of awards at the Cinema Brazil Grand Prize Festival, including Best Supporting Actress, Best Screenplay Adapted, Best Cinematography, Best Art Direction, and Best Costume Design. The director also won an honorable mention at the Denver International Film Festival. It won Best Film Main Program at the Fest International Film Festival, and it has won other awards, including an Audience Award at the International Film Festival of Panama, and awards at the Lima Latin American Film Festival, the Mar del Plata Film Festival, the Munich Film Festival, National Board of Review USA, and the list goes on, both with wins and nominations. As I mentioned, the director is Karim Anouz, and he has won a number of awards. I will probably botch the names as I try to say them because they are in different languages, but one is called Centraflugafen THF, and he won a prize for this movie at the Berlin International Film Festival. Another movie he directed, called A Vida Invisível, won a prize at the Cannes Film Festival. He won an award at the Chicago International Film Festival. It was Best Film for Madame Sata. And he won an award for a movie called O Saiu de Sully at the Cineport Portuguese Film Festival. These movies, among others, are award winners as well as nominees. Some other movies he's directed, and I'm going to stick to those that have names in English, are I Travel Because I Have to, I Come Back Because I Love You, Futuro Beach, and Love for Sale. Julia Stockler plays one of the main characters, Gita, in this movie. She won Best Female Newcomer at the Premio Guarani Awards, and this was for the movie A Vida Invisível, which was by the same director as Invisible Life, and she won awards for the same role at the Sao Paulo Association of Art Critics Awards in the Valladolid International Film Festival. It seems she's mostly been in Spanish or Portuguese films and TV. Carol Duarte plays the other main character, the sister to Gita. She plays Eurydice, and she is the winner of Most Promising Actress at the Extra Television Awards in Brazil for A Força de Querer. Her role in that also won an award for her for Most Promising Actress at the Premio Contigo Brazil Awards. And she won Best Actress for A Vida Invisível also at the Sao Paulo Association of Art Critics Awards. Again, that movie also is by the same director as An Invisible Life. Her role in that movie has also won her awards at the Platino Awards for Ibero-American Cinema and Valladolid International Film Festival. And it appears that she herself has mostly been in Brazilian television and short films. So this movie takes place in Rio de Janeiro. It's the 1950s, and this is a movie that is about two sisters. They were raised in a traditional home and a conservative home, and while it didn't seem too emphasized, I would venture to guess also a pretty religious home. Eurydice is a very talented piano player, and she dreams of being a concert pianist. To do this, she'd like to get into a very well-known music school in Vienna. The other sister, Gita, she dreams of being swept away by an amazing man. She imagines having a life of true love and being forever with her soulmate. What really kicks this movie off is there is one night where there's a gathering with the family, and Eurydice decides that she will help Gita go out to have a night on the town and get together with a sailor that has come to town that she's kind of fallen for. But instead of coming home that night, Gita decides to run off with this sailor. He's from Greece, and she goes with him to Greece. Things don't turn out quite as she expected. She comes home, but at this point, her father is so upset. He disowns his daughter, and his wife goes along with it because that's what she's supposed to do, even though it's clear that she doesn't feel the same. Meanwhile, in the time that Gita has been away, Eurydice gets married. It's what she also feels she's supposed to do. She doesn't seem to truly love the person that she's marrying, but she's told this is what her duty is. And she believes that she'll still be able to have her concert piano career. But things also don't quite turn out for her the way she expects. We see these two women and their separate lives, and throughout the movie, we wonder if they'll ever find each other again. Both are struggling and could really use the support of each other, but the father, in particular, took disowning his daughter Gita so seriously he would not tell Eurydice what had happened to her, nor would he tell Gita, being out of touch with her, anything about her sister. Both Gita and Eurydice have ongoing heartbreak about their separation and inability to be in touch with each other and be in each other's lives. This movie, taking place in the 1950s, also shows a very interesting perspective on what women went through. They seemed pretty much powerless and a victim to societal traditions and expectations. It seems they were there for the man's pleasure. They were meant to take care of home and family. In the case of Gita, she was alone, and she ended up raising a child on her own. In those days, that was really frowned upon, and we get to see how it is that she survives and the hoops she has to jump through in order for her to take good care of her child. When it comes to Eurydice, she also has a child, but she never stops dreaming of becoming a pianist. Her ability to get to Vienna, let alone become a concert pianist, is constantly in question. So much of this movie is based on hope. Hope that these two sisters will find each other. So much of their lives seem oppressive. In these days, it seems that the only future for a woman was to get married and have a family. Gita would have loved that, but having a child on her own disqualified her from that essentially. And actually, it seems she kind of wanted to give up on men, and for good reason based on what her experience had been. She built her own kind of family, one that worked for her. It involved another woman who became a best friend to her, someone who could fill a void. Eurydice, on the other hand, felt really misunderstood. She really hoped to delay having a family so she could pursue her piano career, but things didn't turn out the way she thought they would. There are some really poignant scenes that showed how these women felt in their lives and how much of a void there was because they weren't in each other's lives. Gita, for example, after having her baby, didn't realize that it made sense to stay home and heal. She was ready to go right back out on the town. And she met a man on the dance floor, and it seemed she felt she needed to do him some kind of favor because he had an expectation. That seemed to be some kind of turning point for her. Gita would also write letters to her sister. She deeply hoped that her sister would write back. It wasn't clear to me where she was sending the letters, if it was to her parents, or to her mother, or some other place. But she wasn't getting a response back, and she didn't know if it was because Eurydice wasn't getting her letters, or if something happened, if just like her parents, Eurydice had chose to disown her. Eurydice, on the other hand, really wanted to connect with her sister as well. But her parents kept telling her a story about how her sister was still in Greece and had chosen not to come home. There was a scene in particular that I recall where Eurydice went to the doctor because she wasn't feeling quite right, and she found out that she was expecting a baby. She wanted to keep this information from her husband until she could figure out what needed to happen for her to still have her piano career. But through a string of events that were typical of that time period, well, the husband found out, and Eurydice's options soon became very limited. This movie had a lot going for it. The acting was great. Even though this movie uses subtitles, that did not affect the emotional potency of this movie. Also, I've seen a number of movies where you get to see the lives of two separate people and somehow they may come together or not. I don't recall seeing one as powerful as this one. And I think it's because you get to see each character on their own and how they're struggling in their life. And then you get to know the bigger picture about the potential of the relationship between these two sisters. I don't usually talk about the title of a movie. Often, based on what I know, the title is a lot about marketing, but it's also trying to reflect what happens in the movie. In this case, though, I feel there are multiple meanings that come out of the title Invisible Life. I think it speaks to the plight of women back in that day, especially in Brazil. I think culturally, women were less visible. I think it also speaks to the fact that the two sisters were separated and each of their lives was invisible to the other. And it speaks to just how these two characters were in their lives. It seemed that life revolved around the men who were supposed to be in their lives, and that they were there more to serve than to be visible and have a place, with a meaning that is more than just being part of a family and being of service to them. In both cases, but I think especially for Eurydice, it felt like their souls were really challenged. They yearned for so much more. And there's a point for both of them in the movie where you see something shift in them, that there's a moment where they finally reach some level of satisfaction or happiness, but also you could see to what extent this was a strain on them and the people around them. It's like when they finally got the thing that was important to them, it was at the expense of someone or something, and it really pushed the boundaries and made things very unsettled. I continued having this feeling about how hard it is when we're young, we make choices that we think are for the best, or we feel pushed into those choices, and then they have a ripple effect throughout a lifetime. There are also some very interesting twists in this movie. At one point, Eurydice decides to hire a detective to see if he can find her sister. And what's fascinating is he does find out some information, and it makes total sense about what Eurydice then and her father and family believes, but the audience knows the piece of information that's missing. And once again, our hopes are raised that she will look into the situation deeper and not just take what the detective says at face value. In this situation, too, a piece of information that the father has been leaked, and as a result, we get to see the repercussions of how society has been, how the behavior of her father and the family has been with regard to her sister, and its impact on her. They say it takes a village, and in this movie, we get to see how true that is. The separation of these sisters and their inability to be in touch and connect and commiserate really affects how their life went, and we as the audience get to experience that. For me, there was constantly the question in the back of my mind about how these sisters' lives would have been if they had not been separated. And when they themselves better understand what the consequences are of this separation, we get to see that deep impact. What this movie does so well is it accomplishes a whole time frame. You get to see these sisters as young women grow into adult women and age over time. And you get to see how their lives are so different. And yet they also have many similarities because they're living in the same society. Gita had come back home. She was living not far from her sister, but she didn't know where her sister was living, and her sister didn't know where she was living. It seems just a matter of time before they cross paths, and we get to find out, does that happen? And if so, how? The acting was really compelling. And these two women look so much alike, at times I did have trouble telling them apart. The only thing that helped me know was their particular circumstances, and sometimes the circumstance seemed close enough that it might take me a minute or two before I figure out which sister's story was being told at that moment, because the stories do go back and forth. Also, it took some time before I understood which sister it was that had actually hired the private detective. I knew both sisters wanted to find each other, but it seemed to me that Gita, because she was writing these letters on and not getting a response, that she might have been the one to go to that expense to see if she could find her sister. It wasn't until that defined scene that I talked about with the father that I felt clear that it was actually Eurydice that had hired the detective. This movie also does a really good job of giving a glimpse of what it was like in the 1950s in Brazil. While I don't know how it is there today, I have not actually personally been to Brazil. I do know, at least based on American culture, that, wow, it was a really different time back then. And it probably wasn't too much different from what it was like in America in the 1950s. The women's liberation movement hadn't really happened yet, and in watching this movie, I'm glad that I'm living in this time period. As tragic as this movie was, I really liked it. There was so much going on, there was so much heart in these women. I could relate to what they're going through in almost every step of their lives. If there was anything that I think kind of didn't work for the movie, there's a point where we get to see at least one of the sisters at a much older age, and the movie skips really fast to that point. And so when we see one of the sisters in older age, I wasn't clear on what was happening, who the players were at first, and which sister it was. But this was definitely a movie that I could sink my teeth into. I felt carried away to another time and another place for sure. And I really grew to care about these sisters. So on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the most excellent movie, I'd give this movie a 9. I think it's well worth a watch. I was wondering if a man would enjoy watching this movie. I would say it's definitely a woman's movie, but it's also directed by a man. I think that's really interesting. I think a man watching it would learn a lot and might have some compassion for what a woman's role is, how the fact that her body is what it is can really bring up some issues for her. It was definitely a good watch. Now stay tuned for the next segment of the show, and I'll be talking about the movie Trial by Fire after the break.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome to the third segment of the show. I'm your host, Elizabeth Aaron. In the last segment, I talked about the movie Invisible Life. I'm now going to discuss the movie Trial by Fire. This movie appeared in the US in 2019. It's a biography and drama. It's 2 hours and 7 minutes long, and it's rated R. And this movie is based on an article in The New Yorker by David Gran. This movie was directed by Edward Zwick. He directed Shakespeare in Love, which won Best Picture at the Academy Awards in 1999. That movie also won Best Picture at the BAFTA Awards as well. Other movies he's directed that have won awards include The Last Samurai and Glory at the Heartland Film Festival, and he's had other nominations for these movies and others. Other movies he's directed include Legends of the Fall, Courage Under Fire, and Blood Diamond. This movie stars Jack O'Connell in the lead role of Todd. He's the winner of an EE Rising Star Award at the BAFTA Awards. He's the winner of the Best Actor Award for the movie Home at the Busho Budapest International Short Film Festival. He won a Most Promising Performer Award at the Chicago Film Critics Association Awards for Startup and Unbroken. And he's also a winner of Breakthrough Artist for Startup, Unbroken, and 71 at the Dublin Film Critics Circle Awards. And this is among many other nominations and awards. Other credits to his name include Eden Lake, United, The Man with the Iron Heart, Seaberg, and Jungle Land. And this movie stars Laura Dern, who is an Oscar winner for Best Performance by an Actress in a Supporting Role for Marriage Story. She won a Golden Globe for that same role, and she's also won Golden Globes for her work on Big Little Lies, Enlightened, Recount, and Afterburn. She also won an Emmy for her work in Big Little Lies. And she's won many other awards for her appearance in Marriage Story, and she won an ensemble award with the cast of Little Women at the Faroe Island Film Festival, and this is just to name a few. Her other movies include Blue Velvet, Wild at Heart, Jurassic Park, October Sky, I Am Sam, Year of the Dog, Wild, and Downsizing. If you heard my podcast last week, you heard me talk about a movie called Conviction with Hilary Swank. There's a lot about this movie that reminded me of that movie. The movie is about a man who was wrongly imprisoned. In this movie, the stakes are very high. He was imprisoned because the fire had taken over his home and he was unable to rescue his 3 baby daughters. This happened in Texas, and it was just tragic circumstances. Because the main character, Todd, tended to get into trouble, he was not your upstanding citizen, he was not necessarily trusted by others, he was wrongly found guilty. He was thought to have intentionally set this fire. Meanwhile, he loved his daughters, and to have to go to prison on top of losing them accidentally was a real hardship. And this being Texas, there was a strong death penalty, and so that's what he was given. He was given a death sentence. The movie starts out showing us the tragic event, the fire happening, and how it was impossible for Todd to go back into the home to rescue his babies, not for lack of trying. Throughout the movie, there are more and more details released about the inside scoop as to what Todd's motivation may have been and what really happened that day. This movie is really Todd's story. It's about what happens to him from the moment this fire happens all the way through his experience in prison. The title of this movie is Trial by Fire, which I think is a little bit of a hokey title, but I can see why the writer went for it. But there is a truth in the title, in that in terms of the audience, it felt to me like I was constantly looking at Todd and seeing if I felt that he really deserved to be in prison. Time after time, myself, I felt like he was on trial for me to figure out, was he really guilty or wasn't he? And would I be convinced if he wasn't guilty? Much of the plot of this movie is about whether or not Todd's innocence will be discovered, and if it will be believed, and what will happen as a result. And the movie gives us a lot of reasons to doubt him. He has a really tumultuous relationship with his wife, and there are flashbacks showing difficult times that the two had. They seem to constantly get in fights, constantly disrespect each other. And yet Todd was the one who stayed home and took care of the 3 daughters. It was his wife who worked, and so he was entrusted to them. And there are also flashbacks showing him playing with the daughters and how much he loved them. As an audience member, I was wondering, well, he loves them so much, and it is such a hardship for him and his wife to have these girls. Could he really do something as horrible as set the house on fire intentionally and have the daughters die? It's hard to believe that anybody would intentionally do such a thing. And yet there are aspects of Todd's character that made me question. And seeing what other people thought of him also brought that into question. There are movies where you'll know that somebody is innocent from the beginning and you expect that he's going to be let off the hook. In this movie, while it seemed pretty clear that he was innocent, it was harder to let him off the hook. And I thought that this was a really interesting approach that this movie had. Once Todd is found guilty, we get to see what his life is like in prison, on death row. We have an intimate look at how his behavior shapes who he is while he's in prison. Is he going to transform? Does it matter if he transforms if he's on death row? What we learn early on when you're on death row is you never know when it's going to be your turn. It might be days, weeks, months, or years. In Todd's case, it turned out to be years. And after situations that put him in really hard circumstances, like in solitary confinement, you just really feel for the guy. It's tough to not necessarily have the best behavior, not to be trusted in society, and then put in prison, but wrongly so. This was a similarity to conviction. What is different is that Todd was definitely connected with this fire in that he was home and he wasn't able to rescue his daughters. In conviction, the person who was in prison was definitely not part of the crime. He was just wrongly accused. And it's pretty amazing how things play out differently as a result of that. We get to see Todd connect with some of the other prisoners. He even ends up pretty much befriending the guard. At the beginning, the relationship with the guard was horrible. The guard would stop at nothing to belittle him, victimize him, essentially torture him, even if not physically so. But they had time over the years, and Todd, as he grew and changed, and he did, he and the guard bonded. Though it was pretty difficult for the guard to actually admit that, and we get to see if he does, how he does, and what the impact of Todd is on his life. Now, Todd had pretty much felt like a victim, kind of like a sitting chicken here on death row, until he hears from other inmates on death row that there are things that he can do. He can write letters, he can try to get someone's attention, that maybe the truth can really be found out. In steps Laura Dern, who is an author. She was driving down a road one day, and there was a woman pulled over to the side of the road with car trouble, and she stopped and helped the woman out. When the woman saw the kind of person that Elizabeth was, she proposed that Elizabeth get in touch with Todd. Todd could use some visitors. Not even his wife would go and visit him. This woman knew Todd's story and thought that maybe Elizabeth was the kind of person who could help clear Todd's name. Now, personally, when I saw this, I didn't quite understand it. At first I thought maybe Elizabeth was a lawyer, but she wasn't. And I wanted to understand why this woman chose Elizabeth, of all people, to ask her to help Todd. The woman said she just had this feeling that God meant she and Elizabeth to meet for this purpose. I'm not saying that's impossible. It just felt pretty pie in the sky, not very credible. In any case, Elizabeth pondered it, and she decided to visit Todd. She really became a kind of lifeline for him. But she also believed him, believed that he was innocent. And she set her mind to trying to help him out. Now, as it turns out, she was divorced, and her ex-husband had passed away, and she had 2 teenage children. So besides her work, she wanted to do something to give back somehow, and helping Todd out seemed to be a perfect match. Now, during their visits, they would sit across from each other at a window, holding a phone to talk to each other. But they really seemed to have a connection. And it wasn't clear to me if this was a romantic connection or not. There were moments where there was an inkling of that, and especially because she wasn't married, it made me wonder. But at the same time, Elizabeth seems like such a grounded, practical, enlightened person that I didn't really believe that she would fall for him. And at the same time, there was this kind of innocence about her. Just as she met the woman with the broken car down on the road and offered help, and she seemed to be the kind of person who'd want to adopt all the animals in the animal shelter, she proves herself to have a very big heart. And at the very least, whether there is this spark of romance or not, she's definitely the best person in Todd's life at this point. Almost the only person. She's not one to take a no. She pushes forward. She believes that she will achieve getting the outcome that she wants. Now, Todd has been in prison, I think at the point that she meets him, it's 6 or 7 years. He definitely comes across as a changed man at this point in terms of those who were in the audience who saw him from the start of the movie to the point where they meet. His life has really slowed down a lot. He's reflected on himself. He has more wisdom. And he doesn't have a whole lot of hope that the system is going to change. Elizabeth, though, she is going to push for him getting free. And at a certain point, they clash. And I really appreciate this scene, because to this point, Elizabeth has been a breath of fresh air to him. He's talking to someone who is out in the world and who believes in him and isn't willing to give up on him. But in one particular scene where they're getting together to talk, he explains to her how he's the one who's in there. He's the one who's spending his time on death row. And he doesn't want to just be like her pet project. All the work that she's doing, it may not pay off. And he wants her to really get that. Being as big-hearted as she is, it may be hard for her to take that in, but he is straight with her. He doesn't have the luxury of time to sit around and wait. He needs every moment to count because he doesn't know how many more moments he'll have. But Elizabeth also explains that things change, laws change, science changes, and she has found an expert on fire. And she thinks that this expert may be able to make a difference for him. And as it turns out, she's right to an extent. And I'm not going to say any more. Granted, if you read a description of this movie, you'll know what happens at the end, but I don't want to give it away. I will reiterate, based on the theme of today's show, that things don't always turn out the way you hope they will or expect them to. Now, this comes across as a big twist in this movie. And I know this movie is based on a true story. But I have to believe that based on what happens in this twist, well, the timing seems like real dramatic license was taken. I would be interested in reading the original article that was written about what happened to find out if that was indeed true. Because it seems the way the universe aligned things was very interesting, and it seems from one tragedy, another tragedy is born. I felt the acting was really well done in this movie. There was really great chemistry between Jack O'Donnell and Laura Dern. I thought Stacy, played by Emily Mead, who was Todd's wife in the movie, she did a really excellent job as well. She herself seemed pretty messed up, and I think this must have been a very difficult and complex role to play, because first there is the layer of her losing her daughters. Then there's the layer of her losing her husband in prison. Then there's the layer of whether or not it was really her husband's fault. And no matter what, could she and her husband, based on their very tumultuous past, ever really come together again? There's a reason that she couldn't really bring herself to see him in prison. And eventually, based on Elizabeth's prompting, she finally does go to see Todd. And it's fascinating because it seems Todd has really changed, but Stacy maybe has not changed all that much, but she knows how to continue to push his buttons. It does seem fascinating to me, though, that here Todd has been in prison and taken the time to reflect. And it's not that Stacy hadn't necessarily, but she had different life circumstances, and it just didn't feel to me that she'd grown nearly as much as Todd had. But the characters played off of each other really well. Overall, the movie was well done, but the twist at the end and how things landed, I'll just leave it at this is not an easy movie to stomach. And yet it is a compelling story. I think it's a well-made movie, and while the story is about Todd, after reflecting and talking about it more, I'm realizing that this movie is also about the legal system. Is it fair? Is the death penalty fair? If Todd had been in a different state where there was not a death row, what would his experience have been like? Would it have been different? Would he have been able to make peace with his wife better? Something else that I did appreciate about this movie is there are times that we see Todd speak with his older daughter, who is a toddler. She's kind of in his imagination, but she is someone he can trust, someone he can make peace with, and it's a really healing process for him. And I liked how the movie allowed us to actually visualize that happening. So on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the most excellent movie, I would give this one an 8. This movie has a lot going for it. Again, the end seemed a little far-fetched to me, even if it was true. I can't help but think that maybe the director could have filmed it in a way that it would feel a bit more believable. Now stay tuned for the final segment of the show when I'll be looking at the movie Little Pink House after the break.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blank and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
Welcome to the final segment of the show. I'm your host, Elizabeth Aaron. In the prior segment, I talked about the movie Trial by Fire. I'm now going to discuss the movie Little Pink House. This movie came to the United States in 2018. It is a drama, and it's an hour and 38 minutes long. There's no rating, but I would say it would be for mature audiences, as there is some language and smoking and some hints of a sexual relationship. Also, this movie is based on a true story. This movie won the Audience Award for Best Film at the Vail Film Festival. It won Best Narrative Feature at the Provincetown International Film Festival. It won the Faith and Freedom Award at the Movie Guide Awards. It also won Best Casting in a Motion Picture at the Leo Awards. The director Courtney Balaguer won the Jimmy Stewart Legacy Award at the Heartland International Film Festival, and this film also won Best Original Score at the Anthem Film Festival in Las Vegas. As I mentioned, the director of the film is Courtney Balaguer. Besides the awards that she has won for Little Pink House, she has also won awards for Cute Couple. This was an Audience Choice Award at the Jackson Hole Film Festival, and this movie also won the Competition Shorts Award at the Dances with Films Awards. And Little Pink House is the first feature film that she's directed. This movie stars Catherine Keener, who has been nominated for 2 Oscars. These include Best Performance by an Actress in a Supporting Role for Capote and Best Actress in a Supporting Role for Being John Malkovich. She's also been nominated for Golden Globes, Primetime Emmy Awards, and BAFTA Awards. She did win Best Supporting Actress for Capote at the Clotrudis Awards, and she also won Best Supporting Actress at the Clotrudis Awards for Being John Malkovich. Her roles in these movies have won her other nominations and wins, and she's also won awards through the Film Independent Spirit Awards for Please Give, Synecdoche, New York, and Get Out. Other movies she's been in include Switch, Out of Sight, Full Frontal, The 40-Year-Old Virgin, and The Soloist. This movie also stars Jean Tripplehorn. She's been nominated for a Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Supporting Actress in a Miniseries or Movie for Grey Gardens. And other movies she's been in include Basic Instinct, The Firm, Sliding Doors, Swept Away, A Perfect Man, and Gloria Bell. The script of this movie was also written by the director Courtney Balaguer. This movie starts out with our main character, Suzette Kilo, played by Catherine Keener. She is an EMT nurse. She works on an ambulance, and she's recently relocated back to this town in Connecticut. It seems this is where she grew up, and she needs to find a place to live. She has been working hard as a nurse, and she's saved up, and she's trying to find just the right home. As she's driving by on a road, she sees a for sale sign out in front of a house. She puts on the brakes, backs up, parks, and sort of trespasses. She takes a look around the house. She sees the house is on a beautiful piece of property overlooking a river. The house needs a lot of work, but that means the price is going to be right for her, and she decides to buy it. She fixes it up, and she paints it pink, hence the title Little Pink House. She just falls in love with this place, and she expresses how this really feels like her true home. And as she's fixing the place up, she meets a few interesting characters. One of them owns the deli that is just around the corner. The deli doesn't have a lot of business. It's not doing that great. It's not a super busy town or neighborhood. So the owner, who seems to be quite an extrovert, sees Suzette working in her garden and convinces her to come with him over to the deli and check it out. This is the start of a fast friendship. Now, I do think it was interesting how she took some convincing to go, but that he was that adamant about having her come to his deli. That didn't seem super realistic to me, and like it was put together more for dramatic effect. Meanwhile, she wants to collect some things to put into her home, maybe some antiques or something refinished, so she finds a place that has the kinds of things that she's looking for, and there's a guy there, and he and she seem to kind of hit it off. They're kind of flirtatious, and before you know it, they're in a full-fledged relationship. Now, this also seemed to happen quite quickly. And it took me a second or two to recognize that things had progressed along in their relationship, that they were already a committed couple. That seemed to happen a little too fast than what might happen in real life. Then the next part of the story develops. It involves the governor of Connecticut, and he has his eyes set on bringing in some more jobs to this little town. He hadn't had any luck doing this before because there's a sewage plant that's not too far from an open lot where they would want some kind of business to come in and bring the jobs. Now, this is not far from the neighborhood where Suzette lives, and Suzette even complains a little bit about the smell from time to time, but the governor has a scheme up his sleeve. He calls in an ally, and together they pinpoint a woman who had the skill to lead an organization that had kind of taken a back seat and not been very active, but could be reinvigorated, with the point of bringing in more business to the area. And that woman is Charlotte Wells, played by Jean Tripplehorn. She plays a great character. She's refined and polished, and she really knows how to put a spin on her words to try and make everybody happy. She seems to be a natural salesperson, and she is a go-getter. So she is determined to help the governor achieve what he wants, because she sees through his scheme, and that if he is able to bring in more industry and more jobs, chances are he'll get to be governor again, and maybe that will lead to some higher up positions in the government. She has an attitude with him like, if I scratch your back, you scratch mine. She wants to go places too, and she'd like him to take her with him. So she works hard and is determined to do a bang-up job, and she ends up meeting with an executive of Pfizer. Through some wheelings and dealings and meeting the needs that Pfizer would have, they strike up a deal, and this is looking very good for the governor, very positive. The only thing is, part of the deal that she makes is that the homes in the neighborhood near where this piece of property is will have to be mowed down. She was aware of a loophole in the law which would require people who lived in these homes to give them up under certain circumstances. Now, the law seems to state that the people in these homes will need to give up their homes if it's for a purpose that is going to serve the whole community, for the good of the public. This would be that they give up their homes so the property could be used for building a hospital, something like that. So here's Suzette finally settled in her beautiful little pink house, her dream house. This is where she wants to settle. She's found a man that she loves. Her work situation is good. This is it. But now she's being told that she's going to have to leave. It seems like a no-brainer that she's going to tell them, no, this is my home. This is where I want to stay. And this is true of the other people who own property in the area. And here begins our conflict and our fight. Throughout the rest of the movie, we see the tactics that Charlotte Wells's group is doing in order to get people out of their homes. Charlotte Wells and the people under her seem to say one thing, yet do another. And the neighbors are seeing through all of this. And somehow Suzette seems to be the one who ends up becoming the leader, the organizer of all the people in the neighborhood to fight against this effort. Now, it's a little perplexing as to how she becomes the leader. She seems really resistant to it. It requires her to do public speaking, and it's just not something that she's comfortable with. But ultimately, the neighbors, under Suzette's prompting, get together, they coordinate, and they opt to bring in an attorney. This is an attorney who's pretty young, but has quite a bit of experience. He continues to help the neighbors nudge closer and closer to keeping their homes and what they want, but it's not without challenges and needs for going to different courts and up to higher courts. I won't give it all away, but it is pretty interesting to see how far they have to go in order to keep their homes. There's a lot of politics involved, a lot of personalities clashing. There are lots of twists and turns, and things don't often go the way you expect them to go. There are surprises that really make it an uphill climb for this group of neighbors. It creates an interesting, winding story. I have to say, Catherine Keener is my favorite part of this movie. She is our lead character, but she just does a bang-up job. She's just a regular person. She seems real and in the moment, and it makes a lot of sense why this guy she meets would fall for her. She hasn't had a lot of luck in relationships and has been married more than once before. So moving forward and making a commitment with another person feels a little challenging for her. And she's just very real about it. In that way, I just kept wanting to watch her. I was engrossed with who she was as a character. I could see the wheel spinning in her mind as she'd think things through. I could see the emotional ups and downs she was experiencing. There was one scene in particular that I thought was pretty interesting. There was a threat to the homes in her neighborhood. There was even a big tractor that was there that was threatening to tear down one of the houses. It was a tactic, it seems, and it was a home that was right next to where Suzette's home was. Up until this point, I saw a lot of the back and forth with the different players in the movie, but I hadn't yet myself really felt how unjust the situation was. But based on this scene and how Catherine Keener played it, she became very emotional, and I found myself choking up myself, and I didn't expect it. She just played it so real, and I found a level of empathy for her that I hadn't yet experienced. And maybe it was also that Suzette herself had not completely identified with what exactly was going to happen, but then we were starting to see it realistically. And it was so close to her home, and she really loved her home. She didn't want to give it up. So I really appreciated the way that she approached that particular scene. And it was true for so many scenes. It was also very clear that she didn't want to have to deal with this. She didn't want to be in a position to lead a group of neighbors to fight. It's like the situation was just thrust upon her, and she had to decide, was she going to rise to the occasion or wasn't she? The consequence would be that she would lose her home. And she was clearly a person who was torn about having to show up and do something that she didn't want to do, and that feels like something people go through day in and day out. And especially today with the pandemic. Also, at the end of the movie, there was a clip of the real Suzette Kilo, because she did become somewhat of an activist and spoke out about what was going on in her community. And while she and Catherine Keener look pretty differently, there was something about how Catherine Keener captured her essence. I thought she was really well cast. And when I saw that there was a casting award given, I felt that was really justified. I also liked these other male characters that were in the movie. They were captivating and funny. Callum Rennie played Suzette's boyfriend, and he himself showed himself to be a very real character. Because of Suzette's past, she was a little reluctant to dive headfirst into a relationship, or at least to a committed relationship. And this new guy in her life, he just wasn't sure he was up for that. They were older at this point. They're probably in their 50s, I would guess, and he didn't want to waste any time. And there's a great scene where she goes to his antique place and just says hi. She's been trying to get her nerve up to call him. She's tried a few times and he hasn't picked up. So she finally goes over to see him in person. And he's very real with her. He's straightforward, upfront, says just where he's at. He's not into playing games. It's really pretty charming, and it's a scene where the two of them have to grapple with this conflict and just sit with the uncomfortableness of it. I think they do a great job of showing the nuance of how things can be messy within a relationship. Meanwhile, back to the story of the house, I don't want to give away what happens. I've talked about how there continues to be challenges, but what I will say is that by the end of the movie, things are not completely resolved, and more needs to be done. And this is where, in terms of the theme that I'm talking about around the movies that I've seen today, the ending is not exactly what you might think it would be. In so many movies like this, things get wrapped up and resolved with a little bow on top. That's definitely not the case in this movie. It continues to be messy. And I found it fascinating that this movie would be made when things didn't land with everything complete. That is just an interesting choice. And seeing as the director also is the writer of this movie, I gather she was either trying to make some kind of statement that might literally help finally resolve the issues that the story is all about, or she's making a statement about how things just aren't always clean. Or maybe it's both. In any case, I found this a compelling movie. It was kind of a quiet movie in some ways. And as I said, it's a very real movie. At least the characters seem to me very real. So I do think it is worth seeing. It's also a movie where something happens that could happen to anyone at any time. And I think by watching it, lessons can be learned. If not specifically with this issue about protecting your home, about some other kind of issue where maybe you'd be taken advantage of. So on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being a most excellent movie, I would give this movie an 8. There's good stuff. At the same time, I wouldn't say this movie is for everyone. And I wouldn't say that this is a must-see movie. It's a good movie, it's a good story, and it is worth watching if it's of interest to you. I hope you've enjoyed hearing about the movies The Goldfinch, which I rated a 6, Invisible Life, which I rated a 9, Trial by Fire, which I rated an 8, and Little Pink House, which I also rated an 8. Here's to these movies offering you some inspiration. This is your host, Elizabeth Aaron, signing out. Thank you for listening to the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I would like to ask you to please remember to subscribe to the show and write a nice review that really helps us. Also, if you can please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.